very, very grateful to be here and to share a little bit of knowledge with you and to talk about this important topic. I do want to let everyone know that we are that this is not working. Come on now. We are funded in part by grants from the Office of Violence Against Women from the United States Justice Department. And we certainly want to thank them for their support of the Academy, their support of Congress, of the Congress here that we're taking part in. And I'll let you know a secret that for many, many years, working with the Prosecuting Attorneys Association, I was funded by the same round of grants. So it's really that money and support makes all of this possible. I apologize that I cannot speak your language. For those of you who are bilingual, it's so impressive. I am monolingual. I promise though that, and I did this in the run through, that if I do well enough to get invited back after all of the pandemic and everything has settled down and the world is sort of back to normal, if you invite me back, I'll learn Spanish. And I promise you. So please forgive me for not being able to speak Spanish, your native tongue. I promise you I'm working on it. I am in Michigan. That's where I did most of my practice. That's where I got my start here. And presently, there's Michigan. A wonderful place surrounded by water. In the 48 United States, we are one of the leading states, if not the leader, depending on the year, in the number of boats that are registered. Because what you don't see in this map is all the little lakes that surround here and the rivers. And boating is a big part of Michigan. And being surrounded by the Great Lakes, we have no lack of opportunities to do that. And those are the major cities. A lot of people, they talk about Detroit, and Detroit is there in the corner, and people think they think Michigan, they think Detroit, and Michigan actually is a pretty rural place when you get outside of Detroit. I live in the country. I am surrounded by cornfields and dairy farms, and I am most of Michigan is really quite rural once you get out of that Detroit area. Where I live is in a little town called Portland. Oh, let me go back. Portland. That's Portland. And that's where it is. It's kind of in the middle of the state towards the south. And it's a small town. Some total of about 1,700. I live a couple miles out. Will is that at one point, it had, I think, more breweries, more beer brewing per person than any other place in Michigan. I think at one point we had 3 beer breweries. It's down to 1 now, but being a man who enjoys a craft beer once in a while, this was like heaven for me. So lots of my experiences in Michigan, my trial experiences in Michigan, but in my training work, I've gone to, I think, 45 or 46 of the contiguous United States, plus the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. So I've been around and talked to a lot of folks about what we're going to talk about today, and gotten a whole lot of different perspectives to the extent that I could. And the thing that strikes me in every place I go to is how much we share in terms of how we look at gender-based violence, how we think the system responds to gender-based violence, and how we all, when we think about improving the response, we tend to come to the same thing. And that's really heartening, but it takes a lot of will to do it. And the fact that you are here and have joined me from across the globe tells me that there's the will to be better is out there, up and down the system. And that's what it will take, just like any systemic cultural change. We have benefited, I guess, if you want to call it that, from the news lately, or maybe not so lately, but this idea of the neurobiology of trauma, whether you knew it or not when you heard this stuff, has actually been in the news in this way. That, of course, is the picture from the hearing on the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh, and Dr. Ford, who was testifying at that time. And I didn't listen to a lot of the testimony, but what I did listen to, I was struck by how much the neurobiology of trauma figured into how she was telling her story or her account of what happened, and how little the questioners, whether they were the senators or their counsel, I think understood what she was saying. I don't know that I don't think the decision would be any different had they understood it, but perhaps the treatment would have been different. I was struck by what's on the screen there. This, when she says that neurotransmitters code memories into the hippocampus, she's talking the language of the neurobiology of trauma. And the way that trauma actually changes, or our response to trauma changes our biology, temporarily and sometimes permanently, depending upon how one experiences the trauma. And it has an impact on a lot of different aspects of violence. And most of my research and most of my talking and teaching about this revolves around sexual violence and sexual violence experienced by adults. But we are now starting to look at how it's possible, if not likely, that the impact of the neurobiology of trauma is being seen in all victimization and crime, especially in gender-based violence and victimization. I will be referring to and talking a lot about sexual violence today because that's where we started. That's where most of our work has been directed since around 2000. And that's what I think I can reliably and with some degree of confidence tell you about. But we're starting to look at the impact on victimization when we talk about domestic violence victimization, and victimization for other gender-based crimes. So stay tuned on that. Every crime is different, so, and everybody's reaction to that is going to be different, but they're going to share certain parts of it. And the parts that they might share are the things that Dr. Ford is talking about here. A little more recently, in the last presidential election, when Andrew Yang was running, his wife, Evelyn, took the opportunity to disclose, I think publicly for the first time, that she had been sexually assaulted by her physician, I believe her gynecologist. And we're going to come back to both Dr. Ford and Evelyn Yang as we move on through the next 2 hours or 90 minutes or so. And she gave a interview, I believe it was on CNN, and it's available on YouTube. I would really encourage people to watch it, because it will put in perspective the very real world implications of the neurobiology of trauma, especially in sexual violence. So some of the important things that she said that I drew out of that interview are on the screen now. And we will focus on parts of what she's saying, but I want to take just a minute here to have you all, especially those of you who are judges, who may know this already. This may be just kind of a refresher course for you, or maybe have never considered this at all, or any one of us who responds and works with survivors of domestic or sexual violence. Take a step back, read what Evelyn Yang tells us, and then think about, have you heard survivors that you have worked with? Have you heard this kind of testimony in cases over which you have presided? And what was the general reaction to it? What was our reaction to it? How did we react to it? How do you think the other people in the courtroom reacted to it? If it's a jury trial, how did the jury react to it? How did the other fact finder, if it's a judge? Because we obviously are not trained on this stuff, and we're not born knowing it. Certainly not born knowing or trained to know about the brain science that I'm going to share with you just a little bit, not too much. But we see it. We see it all the time. And then broaden our lens a little bit now. Think about traumatic events that might have occurred, attacks on train systems, or mass casualty events like very severe storms and flooding. And there will be media reports, and they will interview survivors. What do you hear? Do we hear things much like Evelyn Yang is talking about here, or that Christine Blasey Ford was talking about how the body reacted, how their body reacted, about what they remember, how they remember, maybe even about how they reacted in a way that they never thought or dreamed that they would do. These are all things that are expressions of the impact of the neurobiology of trauma that we hear in our lives. And we need to connect now. We need to understand the root of the cause. The root cause then will give us an understanding of how we can assess what we're doing in terms of our response, whatever role we play, and see if we can make it better. Because the goal is for all of us to bring the truth out. And if the neurobiology of trauma has an impact on bringing that truth forward, is a barrier to bringing that truth forward because of how we react to it, well, gosh, I think it's incumbent on us to do this, to understand this, to do that kind of soul searching where gosh, I maybe didn't do it right. And that's how I got into this particular field. I was a trial prosecutor. I was trying all kinds of felony cases, so the most severe cases, sexual assaults in particular, but I would also try murders, of which there were precious few, thankfully, armed robberies, and it's not about me, but frankly, the murders, the armed robberies, I would present the case, I would call the witnesses, I would ask them questions, I would make my arguments, I would work my silver-tongued magic on the jury, and they would all come back, guilty if I proved my case. Except for I would do the same exact thing in the same way for sexual assault cases, but the juries would treat them very differently. And this was really brought home to me personally, and how I became sort of passionate about this stuff in one particular case where the jury acquitted the defendant. I was convinced to this day that he was guilty. And I later ran in a social setting, ran into the victim, the survivor at that point. And I didn't know what, I was scared. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know why it went the way it did. At that point, it was kind of a search of my inside saying, am I doing something wrong? Is there something different about these cases that I need to know about? And that started my journey along this path. And that has brought me to you. So we're going to short circuit the bad effects of all that I had to experience to get to this and come right to the realization that we need to start thinking about trauma, in fact, start reacting to it and responding to it because of that serious impact, because it does make a difference. We will learn as we go forward the differences that the trauma shows us, because how we react, how our bodies react to trauma has an impact upon behavior, how we behave immediately before a traumatic event and during that event and after that event. And it has an extraordinary impact upon how memories are formed, how they are encoded, and we'll explain some of these terms, and retrieved. Essentially, it really has an impact upon and changes what is remembered, how we remember it, and how we retrieve it, what's retrieved, what's remembered, and what can be told consistently over time. And an important part of this understanding, perhaps one of the more important parts of this understanding, is that our bodies do not consciously control how they respond. The brain and the body in tandem respond to trauma without conscious thought from us. And we'll talk about why that actually happens. So with that baseline knowledge, we know that there's an impact, and we know when we'll see it. And we know it has an effect upon how a survivor of trauma behaves, how they can remember and relate to us what occurred, and how that happens without conscious thought. And believe me, for most of us, it happens, they don't know about it. They don't know that not remembering in a certain way is consistent with having experienced a traumatic event. And these signs and the impact has been traditionally misinterpreted by those of us who respond. These are law enforcement officers, as lawyers, as family members, as advocates, as judges, whatever role we play in the response. We have misinterpreted what victims do and say as something other than brain-based reactions to the trauma of sexual violence. And it's been this way since the dawn of time. But we know a lot more now. So we want to bring that to the party, if you will. And what part of where that comes from is our societies are different, our cultures are different. I mean, from one end of Puerto Rico to the other, from Puerto Rico to other places, from other countries. All our cultures are different, but they do share certain things. And one of the things that we think we have found is that in cases of sexual violence, we both in the criminal justice system and really in the broader culture at large, we have this persistent focus on what the victim does or says. The actions of the perpetrator often get lost. And in fact, we're going to lose them here because we're not going to talk so much about the perpetrator. That's a different one. That's a different training. But the persistent focus on victims means that we judge and we look at certain actions or inactions with 20/20 hindsight. We don't put ourselves in the shoes of the victim so much, understanding how those might have come about. And we tend to look at things like voluntary intoxication and illegal drug use, right? And we say, well, we start that process of shifting responsibility, that if only they had not been drinking, if only they had not used certain drugs, they would have not been vulnerable. excuse me, and we kind of lose the fact that that vulnerability like that is pretty much meaningless unless there's someone there to exploit that vulnerability. But that's what we have done in the past. I've done it. I have to do that tough work of looking at my biases, and I have to continually do that. But then we went on to look at, we go on to look and often negatively judge, and my argument is misinterpret certain things that the victims do or don't do, like they don't struggle. In fact, sometimes they do things that seems like it makes it more likely that they will be victims, that they help. They don't yell, they don't cry out, they don't report right away. They don't, they say they can't move when obviously people are capable of moving. They don't leave right away. So we look at those kinds of behaviors usually during the alleged sexual assault and go, if that really happened, nobody would act that way. And we impose in a way our clear-eyed reasoning of, if this happened, then they should have done this in response, to a situation where maybe clear-eyed reasoning wasn't that available to them biologically. And then we look at how people behave afterwards, victims behave afterwards, especially when we talk with them in interviews or when we judge their credibility on the stand. If we look at something and we go, again, in that use of that 20/20 hindsight clear-eyed reasoning, boy, that seems inappropriate. Why would you laugh? Why didn't you tell us sooner about this fact? Those kinds of things are things that we use to judge the credibility, often negatively, of survivors. And as we progress, okay. All right, did you lose me?
Sí. ¿Puedes repetir lo último que
Okay.
dijo? Por favor. Gracias.
Can you repeat the last part that you were talking about? Because yes, we did lose you.
We will start again. We will do more. How's that? There we go. And I got the notice like just when I was talking about this slide. So I'll just very quickly, the point of this, the takeaway message is that persistent focus on what the victim did or didn't do, or what the victim remembers, judged often by us as, well, we wouldn't do that, or that doesn't seem to make sense, is how often the brain-based impact and of trauma is misjudged and misinterpreted as, frankly, a lack of credibility or a hit on the credibility of those who are sharing their accounts with us. So in the memory arena, we like to have details, and we like people who are sure of what happened. and we hate inconsistencies. So we'll try to, we will do, I know that's one of the biggest things when I'm doing trial, training trial attorneys, is that we're all afraid of inconsistencies, even though we do pretty good with dealing with inconsistencies in our ordinary life. When it happens in court, when it happens in the judicial arena, we tend to think that inconsistencies mean lies, and they don't. They mean that they're inconsistencies. They may mean that people are wrong. They may mean that they're lying. There's an awful lot of things that can happen in between there. So again, I think that when we progress through the afternoon today, we're going to see that a lot of the things that we talked about, not the drug use so much, but some of these other things are actually just brain-based behaviors that are done to survive, and that probably we all would behave in much the same way. And with that, I want to show you a video. I have optimized this for video and sound, so it should work. And this video it will show most of a stabbing of a police officer, and he eventually shoots and kills his attacker, and he survives. It could be kind of disturbing for people to watch, so feel free to just turn things off for the 3 or 4 minutes if it is going to disturb you in that way. But I want you to watch this, and then we're not here face to face, so I can't really get feedback from you. But I'm going to point out what I think is important in that video, and you can see whether you saw that and thought that was important, or whether you saw something else.
On an October night in Miami, Dominic Jean tried setting fire to an 8,000-gallon underground storage tank at this gas station next to Miami's International Airport. Surveillance footage shows the smoke smoldering as Jean grabs a gas pump and starts dousing the ground.
It scared me because I thought, wow, we're going to die.
That's Miami-Dade County Police Officer Mario Gutierrez, who happened to be patrolling the area, racing in, jumps out of his car, hits the emergency shutoff to the gas pumps, then finds himself standing over a simmering time bomb, unsure if the gas tanks would explode.
It would have been a massive chaos. They would have thought it was terrorism. Who knows? They wouldn't have been able to talk to me because I would have been nothing but vaporized.
Gutierrez tries stopping Dominic Jean with a taser, but it didn't work. Jean starts wildly trying to stab Gutierrez with a knife and a screwdriver.
It came from my throat, and I blocked it.
Gutierrez falls to the ground. Jean viciously swings at him more than 20 times.
That was a fight to the death, and only one person was going to walk away from that.
Gutierrez is stabbed about a dozen times, but he's able to briefly kick the man off just long enough to grab his gun, firing 5 times, killing Jean on the spot.
I never heard the gunshots, never heard them. All I heard was the clinking of the shell casings hitting the ground.
It all lasted less than 30 seconds, but dealing with the emotions hasn't always been easy.
I felt like I failed. I was. I need to know that I put up a fight, that I fought this guy, because I didn't remember. I had no recollection of it. So that really bothered me.
These days, Officer Gutierrez patrols the Miami airport alongside his hero.
All right, so who are these guys we're gonna go see?
You're saying Juan Leon, who saved my life.
It was Officer Juan Leon who found Gutierrez bleeding on the ground that night.
I'm actually going to stop it there because I think that that story was about, when it was first broadcast, about the heroism of those that responded and kept him alive. But I think that it's really about something else. And I've seen this a lot. I've used this hundreds of times, and I see things. I'm still seeing things occasionally in it that I didn't see before. But here's what I think is important for us to draw out of that. Number one, that if we just look at what happened, what do we tend to call people who rush in to danger and use a shutoff valve in a gas station that I didn't even know existed. Who knew? And basically risks his life for those around him that he doesn't even know. He doesn't know all the people that are threatened by potential explosion. Yet he risks his life to do that, and he gets injured. We call them heroes. But then with that in mind, look at how Officer Gutierrez behaved when he was asked to recall what happened. You saw what? You see you see a physical reaction to the retelling of what happened. And he tells us that I didn't know that I fought back. I needed to know that I fought back. Well, a couple things about that. We would call him a hero, and he's looking at it that he might have somehow failed, even though I can guarantee you he's seen this video more than I have, and he knows he fought back, and he knows he saved people. And still, when he's asked to recall it, you see a physical reaction, and you see that idea of, I need to know, because he didn't remember fighting back. I think that's important, and as it is fascinating. The other thing about this is the what he remembers. That he said, what, I remember I shot him. I don't know how many times I shot him. Didn't remember the shots themselves. I remembered the sound of the shell casings, the bullet casings landing on the ground. We all know that with the semi-automatic weapons that the police use, that they eject the pistol ejects a shell, a spent cartridge, and they hit, and there's a distinctive sound there of brass hitting the ground. That's what he remembers. Not how many times he shot. Now think about it. When we're talking to him, say if he were called upon to testify about what happened, we would probably ask him, how many times did you shoot? He didn't know. How can you not know? You were the one pulling the trigger. He remembers the brass hitting the cement, but he doesn't remember the sound of the gun going off. And I don't know, obviously, how many of you have ever fired a weapon like that. When I was a working prosecutor, the police officers that I worked with would take me out, permit me to go out and shoot their firearms with them. I think they did that mostly to make themselves feel good, because I couldn't hit the target and they could. But it's loud. They would do it with ear protection on, and then they would do it without the ear protection on, for a very important reason, that when you're in the field, you're not going to have that ear protection. But he doesn't remember that sound. And the whole explanation of the attack and the details that he is able to come out with, compared to what we saw and compared to what maybe we could ask him about, you see that he remembers certain things and not others. He's not lying. He's being a victim of trauma. The trauma of that attack and that response has had a lasting impact on him. It's probably now, when that was made, what, 12 years maybe after the event, maybe less, but regardless of how long, he's still able to bring himself back with that physical reaction. Keep all that in mind with Officer Gutierrez, because we're going to come back to it as we explain how that could be, that he's behaving in that way and what causes it. So now is a good time to actually define some terms, a single term. I'm talking about trauma, and trauma is trauma is trauma, but depending on the context, it means something different. Trauma to a medical professional may well mean a broken bone, a cut, a wound of some site. That is actually a trauma. For our purposes, the trauma we're talking about is an event or an experience. And it's defined by the American Psychiatric Association as one where someone has been exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. The only actual crime that's defined in there is sexual violence. And because it's included in the definition, we should look at how we talk about or how the law handles sexual violence. You know, how we parse out what we think is important and what we think is serious when those folks who deal with the whole human are telling us that it's the whole experience that's important. It's the sexual violence aspect of it, not whether they used a gun or a knife, but what was taken from them in terms of autonomy in sexual violence. And it's exposure to actual threatened death or serious injury. It could be exposure to loved ones as well, right? If you watch it, that's a lot of us feel a certain level of trauma when we watch news events involving war or terrorism or natural disasters, those kinds of things, because we empathize with the suffering of our fellow human. So we're focusing on this idea of a traumatic event as defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And that exposure is really defined by the experience and perspective of the one surviving it. We may not think that death was imminent. It's not really a threatened death. But if they did, they experienced trauma. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as well as we go through this, is that we've got to look at this thing in terms of the perspective of the person who survived, not our perspective. And to the extent that we can do this. So using that definition, I want to tell you that there are different kinds of trauma, I think, that we can talk about. And a lot of the research that I'm going to share with you, the insights that other people have had that they've shared with me, come from all various different kinds of disciplines that work with different kinds of trauma, but consistently it is trauma. As an example, much of what we know about the experience of trauma, we've learned from combat veterans, right? And we've had different words for it. Back in the early times of World War I or II, say, it was, we called things like shell shock or battle fatigue. It was a set of behaviors that we saw that people showed us after they were engaged in combat. And in the time of World War II, especially, we were talking about, we didn't talk about trauma, we talked about battle fatigue, and we layered on some cultural things about courage and the willingness to fight and manliness and a whole bunch of other cultural overlays that that has exacerbated a problem of trauma changes us. It changes our neurobiology and it makes us behave in certain ways. And if it's not dealt with in certain ways, if it's not confronted and worked on and integrated, into our experience and our personalities, then it becomes a serious injury. And we saw this and we started to look at it, the big we, in World War II. And then if we fast forward on to, say, the Vietnam War, and the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder became kind of the movie of the week. Those of you who are a certain age, and like I am, and as young as I look, I'm actually pretty old. And there used to be this thing called the movie of the week on one of the 3 TV channels that we had. And the movie of the week would often have a Vietnam veteran who was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And the way they portrayed that was that the character of the Vietnam veteran was reliving the traumatic events that he experienced in Vietnam. This had a serious impact on me, as my father is a combat veteran, was a combat veteran of Vietnam. And I was seeing these things at a time when, makes a little kid like me wonder, is my daughter the Viet Cong? And have these intrusive memories and flashbacks. Just so you know, he dealt with it in a very different way. He came back and became an alcoholic. And he did not share experiences until with my son, with my youngest son, his grandson, and he gave him a bunch of pictures and slides from Vietnam. And we heard stories as we were listening to him and my son talk that we had never heard before. And it was just shot through, if you will, with the language of having experienced trauma. So that was my father's and my family's experience with that. But we began to look at that experience, the experience of trauma, in a different way. We began to realize that the experience and our body's reaction to it is biologically driven in a large part. So it's not a character flaw, it's not cowardice, it's biology. And as our knowledge began to advance and our ability to peer into our heads literally with things like the functional MRI, as that came online in the late 90s, we began to learn so much more about how the brain acts and our ability to test for certain substances and to follow them in the bloodstream and to understand them. It really advanced our understanding of the biology and especially the neurobiology of trauma. We think we have a pretty good handle now on what mechanisms, what parts of the brain, what areas and regions of the brain are activated during trauma, what they do, what chemicals, hormones are excreted by which parts of the body in response to that, what they do to the body, and what the long-term consequences are. But we will always learn more. And the knowledge that we have now has moved from that combat situation to realizing that there are almost infinite number of traumatic events that one can experience in their lives. I would say that we have all experienced trauma. It's ubiquitous. We have all felt it in fear. And hopefully most of us have not been exposed to actual or threatened death or injury or sexual violence, but undoubtedly, given the numbers that are out there, we are talking with someone who has had that experience. But trauma is ubiquitous. And these reactions that we're going to talk about are ubiquitous. It's only when it collides with the criminal justice system that we start to think, wow, we've really kind of handled it not so well lately. In fact, I'm going to back off from that. The helping professions, you know, the psychiatrists, psychologists, masters of social work, advocates, victim advocates, they've been thinking about and working on improving responses and treatment for trauma victims for decades now. It's really just now, and just in the last 20 years or so, which in the terms of the law is really recent, isn't it? Is that we have begun to think about trauma in the context of the forensic, in the context of the trial, in the context of investigations. And that was, of course, something that we learned when we were doing the 400 project and having to talk with survivors of sexual violence who had been treated somewhat unfairly or terribly unfairly by the system, and how they processed that trauma as we showed up at their door, sometimes 10 years later, and said, "Oh, I'm sorry you were raped, but we know who it is now." In any event, trauma is defined as that for our purposes. Our knowledge is growing, still growing by leaps and bounds. In fact, you can take a blood sample from trauma victims, and you could put them in front of an expert in this field, and they could, not me, they could look at the profile and what substances have been created by the body and at given times, and they can point out this person is a victim of trauma, this person is a victim of trauma, this person is a victim of trauma. What they can't do, and probably never will be able to do, is say what the trauma was, but they can certainly say this is the profile chemically of a body that is reacting to trauma, reacting to fear of threatened death. So trauma, I can't grade trauma. We're not going to, you know, it's worse if it's combat and less if it's sexual assault and less still if it's child. We don't do that. It's trauma. Trauma is trauma, and everybody reacts to it in a certain or different way. And it's frozen. There we go. There are different kinds of trauma, though. They're not what the causes are, but just how it's experienced. And I'm going to quickly go through those. You want to keep in mind when we're talking that there is a thing called secondary trauma. And that's a big one for us, because secondary trauma, as we're going to use it, is what we do to people who have suffered trauma in the system. Secondary trauma is the trauma that is experienced by a victim when they go to, say, the doctor, or they come to me and I treat them in a certain way. A better example would be that someone like me doesn't believe them and queries them and really makes it worse that they actually reported their victimization because of what people say and the judgments they make about them. That's secondary trauma. The goal in all of this, one of the goals in all of this, is to realize that because we are going to ask them what happened, we are going to talk about a traumatic event, cannot avoid causing some measure of secondary trauma. But everything we do and everything we say can help tamp down the trauma response, or it can make it worse. So our goal here, one of our goals here, is to understand that we want to minimize as much as we can the experience of secondary trauma. There is the idea of vicarious trauma, and then I talked about that before. I didn't use those words. Vicarious trauma is that trauma that you and I experience listening to these stories all the time, dealing with these people whose lives are wrecked by this, dealing with these people whose lives are not wrecked, but they had a very difficult journey back to something that resembles wholeness. Vicarious trauma is sometimes called burnout, and there's a whole field of study about it, and it's a very real thing. I can tell you, it's a very real thing. I was a high pressure, high level trial prosecutor, and I left that job. And part of my leaving that job was vicarious trauma. I got tired of people exploiting other people. I couldn't, it was starting to have an impact on how I thought in my relationships. And I took an opportunity after that to leave. That's vicarious trauma. You look around you and you see your colleagues and you'll know the ones that are really burned out. Their family relationships are impacted. You know them, you've seen them. It could be you. It certainly was me. We also have to kind of deal with and think about that personal historical trauma. By that, I mean, people come to us in a system, in our everyday lives. We don't know what they've experienced. We don't know whether they have been victimized in the past and how they survived. Without knowing that, we can look at certain things that they do or don't do in the context of the recent victimization and say, it doesn't make sense. Without knowing that what they're doing might actually be in part driven by the personal trauma that they had felt in the past. The obvious example is what goes on with child abuse victims as they grow up and become adults, and process continually that trauma of betrayal. There's also the cultural trauma that we have to think about. And this is sometimes difficult for people. How does cultural trauma, how does the fact that people from Africa were enslaved to build a country impact people who are Americans now, but just happen to share the same skin color? Well, it does. I think many of us have parts of our culture that we can point to and say that that was a cultural trauma that that we actually adopt. It becomes part, if you will, of the collective DNA, and you can't escape it. It has to be recognized, and it has to be acknowledged, and it has to be confronted. And that's sometimes difficult to do. But I think of things like the Trail of Tears, and with here in the 48, the lower 48, we're, you know, our government really committed an atrocity by force marching the Cherokee from their ancestral living place, Florida, Alabama, those places, to the plains, during which hundreds, if not thousands, died. That's a trauma that's still felt by members of those tribes. And if we probably won't know about it. If we do suspect it, you know, we may not know the extent of it. But the cultural trauma and how that impacts response is something that we have to be aware of. But for our purposes, I'm looking at mostly the incident that we're talking about and the trauma that comes from that, the secondary trauma, and tamping that down, and how, I guess, the personal historical trauma will drive a response that we may not understand. So, all right, we're going to go to brain school, folks. And this is the first year of medical school compressed into about 6 minutes. So buckle up, it's going to be a bumpy ride. And this is the only Latin I will speak to you with, or Greek, as it may be. But there are structures in the brain that we need to know about. You don't need to be able to regurgitate this and you know, wake up the kids when you get home at night and tell them about this. But we need to understand in any way we can what structures in the brain we're talking about when we talk about trauma and how it's experienced. First one I want to talk about is this thing called the amygdala, which I believe is Greek for almond. It's an almond-shaped gland or region of the brain that is shared by many, many, many animals, if not all animals that have a reasonably developed brain. It develops very early on, and it is, you can think of it as our fear center. It's the part of the brain that will take in sensory stimuli, will see something, hear something, that big deal, or it says danger, danger, danger. All right. And it is key in storing sensory and emotional memories when it sees or interprets stimuli as dangerous. And it's also key in the biological changes that occur when we experience trauma. And it's basically what makes us afraid, what drives us. It's I like to call it the lizard part of the brain. The next part of the brain that I want to talk about is the hypothalamus, which is close to the amygdala there in the brain stem part. And it works with the amygdala and the pituitary gland in releasing chemicals in response to signals of danger from the amygdala. So the amygdala receives stimuli, sees what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we smell. It interprets it as either significant in terms of danger or insignificant. We don't care about it. It's not dangerous. In which case our brains deal with it differently. If it interprets sensory input as dangerous, then it starts the cascade. And how it's explained is it's called the defense cascade response. And that's kind of a construct that people way smarter than me put on all this, and that the amygdala does its thing, and it just keeps it. The rest of the body follows along. So, and remember those two structures: the amygdala, the hypothalamus. You need to remember the pituitary gland. And one of the conceptual ways to look at this at the very beginning of that cascade, one of the things that we see first, that happens first, is called the Hpa Axis. Apparently medicine is like law, and that they like to, three-prong tests and axes and things like that, rather than just tell us what happens. So we put these names on it. So the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. Kind of get an idea where we're headed. I think when I say adrenal, you're thinking adrenaline, right? And that's an important part of this. So this is a representation of and simplification of what happens. The amygdala detects a threat, it activates the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, acting in tandem, release an absolute tsunami of hormones, a tsunami of chemicals, neurotransmitters, largely, that are made and dumped in our bloodstream instantly or nearly instantaneously without conscious thought in response to danger. All right. And those chemicals, being neurotransmitters, have an effect on all systems in our body. This cascade response affects every system: the muscles, the heart, which is just a muscle, the autonomic, the things that we do involuntarily, the voluntary muscles, our gut, and the gut provides feedback as well. So certain things happen when all these chemicals are dumped in. The impact of which, think back to Officer Gutierrez and how he reacted in the retelling. So that tsunami is full of four chemicals that we're going to talk about, four categories of chemicals that are important. A whole lot of other ones too. The first one is that catecholamines. Catecholamines are chemicals, norepinephrine, also dopamine, which has a certain effect. Those kinds of, that end in INE chemicals, hormones, neurotransmitters, are the catecholamines, right? And they exist largely to provide natural energy for us. You can see where the body is starting to prepare for reacting in any way necessary to survive. Another thing that is dumped out are steroids, corticosteroids generally, which we can look at as energy, not sugars and things like that. That would be an oversimplification, or maybe even wrong, but that's what it is. It provides energy, right? So again, the imperative for the body is to survive. The brain wishes to survive, right? Everything that is going to be dumped into the body, everything that the brain is going to drive, every system is going to work to survive whatever attack or thing that is happening to them, all right? And another category of chemicals that's emptied into our bloodstreams are opioids, which, you know, morphine, things like that. I have had since August, I've had 3 surgeries since August, and I got opioid drugs to control post-surgery pain, morphine, things like that. It's an analgesic, painkiller, and it also will give you a feeling of well-being. And then the fourth category of chemicals is oxytocin. You guys know what oxytocin is? It's that feel-good chemical, that bonding chemical, that chemical that's dumped when you see the one you love, that chemical that is dumped when a baby is born, kind of makes us forget the pain, right? I didn't feel any pain when my baby was born, but my wife apparently did. But it, you know, but we don't necessarily remember it because we have such extraordinary good feelings of love and bonding, if all goes well, with that baby, right? That's why God made them cute, because if we remembered how bad it is and they were ugly, we would never have another one. So oxytocin, opioids, those things are kind of the natural balance or counterweight to the catecholamines and the corticosteroids. And the brain, working with the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands and getting feedback from the other systems, will try to balance those chemicals in a way to maximize survival. You can see, I think, in certain ways why that would be important. You know, why it would be important not to feel pain, why it would be important to have some energy to run away if that's what is appropriate. So those keep those things in mind as much as you can when we start talking about behaviors and how an opioid in your system, if it becomes out of balance, if we have too much for whatever reason, how one might behave. Even if the only thing that we're doing is asking them to relate to us what happened to them, the traumatic event. So I like research. I am not generally a researcher on my own. I'm just a simple country lawyer trying to do right and trying to do well at the same time. I don't know a lot. I know a little bit about a few things, a lot about 1 or 2 things, but I'm just a simple guy. As much as I love research, you have to, if I cite research, get it yourself and read it. But I do want to bring you the cutting edge research about our behavior in the face of trauma. And that's why I want to show you the next video. So there's no trigger warning here. This is just an example of some of the behaviors that can happen when we're confronted with a threat.
What a weirdo.
Oh! You scared the shit out of me.
Oh my god. This thing every single fucking year. On YouTube. That was a great. Yeah, I knew you were in there.
Yeah, I knew you were in there.
Alright. Whoa, is there someone in there? Did you touch him? Alex, wait!
To hold them accountable. Oh, God. Don't ever do that. That was pretty scary. You're the worst looking snowman I've ever seen.
Oh shit! Mom, you real? Help me!
Fuck. Oh, I was about to bang you, yo. You can't do that to somebody that's gonna have the instincts to swing. No one knows.
What is this? That is awesome.
Spaceship. Gosh darn it! Thank you.
Holy crap! I was ready to hit that motherfucker.
I love it.
Hi there, snowman.
Hello.
Oh shit!
You shoot!
You see, I have to put something funny in there in the serious subject, but you see what's, you see the reaction. Now, I'm not going to pretend that trauma is coming from that, but the same response, that fear response, is dumping the same chemicals into the bodies of those people who are frightened. I like to say that one of the reactions that you see is the Samuel L. Jackson, I'm going to drop the F-bomb reaction, or there's a lot of swearing going on right away when they do that. But some of the other things you see are, remember how many people, the first thing they do is they get distance between them and what scared them and threatened them. A lot of people jumped out of the way. They made fun of it on the video, right? They slowed it down. And you see their facial expressions, the tightening of the muscles, the baring of the teeth, getting the distance away from the threat. Instantaneous reaction, they didn't think, oh, this is kind of scary. I'm going to get distance between me and this thing that is scary. The body does it instantaneously. It's survival. Also, you see the proximity matters. How close a threat is really can have an impact upon our response or the biological response. We'll keep talking about this cascade response, but a response to a threat that is in close proximity is going to be different, perhaps, than one that is further away. Our reactions may well be different. And there's also those that fight back, right? But what is fighting back? In this context and in others, it's an attempt to get away, to put distance between you and the threat. And the body lashes out. A lot of people took the aggressive stance, kicked, those kinds of reactions are, your typical close proximity threat, body says fight. For those that ran away, you also, and others, you also saw a familiar reaction, and that is there's a lot of energy that has to get burned off, right? The people that turn around and do the fighting thing, I'm going to take you on, and I was about ready to hit that guy, and the instant response to go like that and then to flip them the bird. The first part of that, those things are all biological responses to that threat that the amygdala has interpreted. Snowman not threatening, snowman moves, threat, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, adrenal glands, heart, everything gets going. Everything is activated, impacted, changed, if you will, in some way, instantaneously, once the amygdala senses that. Now, I just imagine for a minute you're walking through the forest, all right, and you're having a good time. Let's say you're gonna go fishing in the river. The salmon are running, and who else shares the river and the salmon with the fishermen? The grizzly bears. So you're walking through the forest, you don't see anything, everything is cool. And you're heading towards your fishing spot, and then you hear and see this. What do you think your body's reaction will be? Would you run away? What are people told when you see a bear? Are you told to run away? No, you're told not to run away, because running away may well kind of trigger the predator response in the bear, and the bear will chase you. I like to say that, I probably would have to change my clothes if the bear jumped up like that. And then what about if you're not going to run away? What are your options, right? Clearly, you're going to be frightened. This is clearly a threat. And you can't run away. What does your body do? Well, in general, the body's first response often is to freeze and assess the situation, right? It's that period of actuation of the limbic system, of the amygdala and all that, the arousal of that part of the brain, and the dump of hormones might make someone freeze rather than run away, rather than fight. And they're, in a very real sense, the body is saying, okay, get ready for action. I'm going to give you some energy. I'm going to give you some, increase your heart rate. I'm going to increase blood pressure. I'm going to increase your breathing. Again, I want you to think back to Officer Gutierrez. Did you see an increase in his breathing? Did you see any kind of physical signs that he was experiencing stress at that point? Because that's really what this is. It's a stress response. So, and also, of course, the digestive system will shut down, because what you had for lunch isn't important when you're trying to avoid being lunch. And so these are all reactions that happen quite quickly without our conscious thought, and we assess and freeze. Now, and again, a lot depends upon proximity, but I want you to think again, in your experience, working with people who might be survivors of trauma. Have you heard it? Have you heard people say, I froze? I couldn't do anything? Have you yourself experienced it? I know I have. And also think back to what Evelyn Yang said. I just kind of froze, like a deer in the headlights, just frozen. I think there's several things possibly going on here. One is that first initial reaction to the change in her biology and neurobiology. The body is telling her and us, because she's telling us, that she's frozen because that's the best way to survive the attack. Often, we culturally and legally interpret inaction as something really different, don't we? Not all of us, not all the time, but certainly broader culturally, I would expect us to see this a lot more. If you froze in the face of danger, that's questioned. It could very well be, and probably is, the body's reaction naturally, the natural and normal reaction to an extraordinarily abnormal event. So when we freeze, and I'm living in the country, I get to walk my dog. I told you I had 3 surgeries. One thing I can do, and about the only thing I could do for many months, was walk the dog. So I took the dog on lots of walks. Dogs, she can smell a rabbit, but if she doesn't smell a rabbit, and the rabbit doesn't move, she could walk right past that rabbit and not pay attention to it at all. if the rabbit runs, she'll go after it. It triggers a response in her, right? So that's the purpose of this freeze. It might make the difference between survival and getting caught by my dog or killed by whatever is threatening someone. Flight, of course, is a way of getting away. You saw it in the video, the snowman video. Fighting, what's fighting, right? It's a way to escape the threat, right? If you can't run away from it, you might have to duke it out and give yourself time to run away, right? And in the example of the bear, flight is not likely to be the best option. In fact, you're told not to do it. Fighting is kind of problematic too, isn't it? Right? Because who wins a fight between a man and a bear? I'll put my money on the bear all the time. So what if fleeing isn't really possible, or is perceived to be impossible, and fighting isn't really a good idea? It would increase danger and like the likelihood that you're going to die. What does your body do at that point? And this is part of that cascade response. The body will kind of enter into a state that is, I guess, the last ditch thing it can do before, as a means of survival. And that response is called tonic immobility. The last resort, when escape is impossible or appears to be so, and fighting is impossible or appears to be so, the body drastically acts to survive. What it does is it puts us in a state of tonic immobility. And you can break down and see how those words are constructed. It basically is the inability to move. It's the inability to voluntarily move your muscles. Again, if you have heard in any part of your life or experienced this yourself, someone tells you, I felt like I couldn't move, it very well could be tonic immobility. If you hear, and I heard this a lot and had trouble, frankly, explaining this to juries until I learned much of this, I couldn't scream. Well, of course you could scream. Everybody could scream. You could have been screaming 30 seconds before this, but then at some point, the body responds in that last ditch effort to survive by putting the body in a state of tonic immobility. People who have survived in this way describe things like feeling cold, feeling unable to move. Now, obviously, we can't research this. We do research with animals. We scare them to death. We put them in certain positions, and they go into a state of tonic immobility. We can't do that with humans, obviously, for no other reason than who the heck's going to volunteer for that study. But we know from interviews that tonic immobility is not uncommon. I'll say that a different way, is probably common at some point in a traumatic experience, especially in that traumatic experience of sexual assault, because the threat is right there. It's close proximity, it's immediate, and it's the results, am I going to survive or not, are really unknown. It's research is now at a place like 55% of victims. Other research, as we get more data, these data are starting to suggest that tonic immobility at some point during a sexual assault is experienced by a much greater percentage of victims than 50%. So we hear it. I felt like I couldn't move. I felt like I couldn't scream. I felt cold. I was shaking. So all of those things are the paltry human description for that flood of hormones and the changes in our biology that cause our muscles to stop taking orders from our brain. We can't move, we can't scream. Now, and if you think about it, and again, you saw this in some of the stuff that we have read, about Evelyn Yang, excuse me, and other survivors, probably in our own experiences, is that that in itself is traumatizing. That the thought that you were immobile and unable to move is scary. You thought you would fight back. You were told, you were raised by your parents, if anything like this happens to you, you fight back, right? And what we are learning is that the experience of tonic immobility within the sexual assault is something independent that traumatizes survivors, and it scares the bejesus out of us, all right? It's also associated with an increase in self-blame. That is exactly what we hear all the time from survivors, isn't it? Well, if only I had or hadn't, or I didn't move, I should have moved, I should have been able to move, I always said I would move, right? And they begin to blame themselves. And then we can certainly cause a greater level of secondary trauma if we pile in with them and blame them as well. And it's also associated with a decrease in access to support and decreased reporting. Those words are important, associated with. I don't think we're to the point where we can say it's cause and effect, or at least the researchers aren't, scientists aren't at that point, but that association is pretty strong. And I think it, if we pushed researchers, they'd move from association to cause. And that it's just curious that the trauma that people experience in terms of entering tonic immobility means that they are less likely to seek out advocates who can help them work with their experience and understand the context of their emotions. It also decreases the amount of reporting of sexual assaults, which we know, of course, is already a problematic thing, that people won't report for a variety of reasons, this included. So what does that mean for us? Obviously, it means in terms of secondary, it means looking critically at, looking critically at, I wonder if that, I just knocked over my light stand, looking critically at how we react in the system to disclosures about tonic immobility. Can we work in our roles to educate and explain this behavior, this phenomena, as common, as natural, and as a normal brain-based biological reaction to an extraordinarily abnormal event? That's a goal. That's something that we should be able to do. At least we can make inroads. Tonic immobility is characterized by a sudden onset and abrupt termination. It happens quick and it ends quick. It happens, maybe it's just as long as the body thinks it needs to survive. And again, we get the idea about, or we get the fact of experiencing tonic immobility, not because we're watching sexual assault victims or because we're putting people in fear to see how they become tonically immobile. It's that we hear it all the time from victims. We hear it from traffic accident survivors. We hear it from combat survivors. We hear it from survivors of collapsed buildings, that people feel immobile, and in fact they are. They feel cold and numb. Remember those hormones that had an analgesic pain-killing effect? They feel no pain or greatly reduced pain. Again, that all makes sense as a matter of survival, doesn't it? Because feeling that pain would probably minimize rather than maximize chances of survival. Going back to the bear example, if the bear hits me, I'm on the ground immobile, which I think people are told to do, to play dead, which is, well, so I'm there and the bear hits me. If the reaction of the bear might be very different if I do nothing, it might go away. It might think that I'm dead already and they don't want to eat a recently dead thing. Or if I am hit and it hurts and I react to that pain, You know, I lash out, I scream, I say, hey, bear, that hurt. What might happen? The bear might say, oh, it's alive. I'm gonna finish off the job here and eat it. So the killing of that pain really makes us, or helps us survive a whole host of traumatic situations. You've probably heard it. Heard the stories about mothers lifting up cars, about people breaking bones and not realizing it until the traumatic event or stressful event is over. Perhaps you've felt that yourself. I have. I was working in the yard several years ago, and I lifted up something and detached the bicep tendon, basically broke a tendon, severed a tendon in my arm. And I went into where my wife was in the house, and I was smiling and said, I think I broke my effing arm. And she looked at me, and I wasn't crying out. I wasn't jumping up and down in pain. I didn't feel pain, frankly, then. And she had to ask, do you mean go to the emergency room, real doctor broke your arm, or go to, the family doctor or the urgent care facility broke your arm? And eventually I said, yeah, I think I got to go to the emergency room. I got to go to the real doctor. I think I needed help. By the time I got to the doctor, it was pretty obvious. I did feel the pain, but in the immediate aftermath, my body had produced enough of those hormones that killed the pain to allow me to kind of operate to get to a place of safety. And one last thing I want to talk about in this idea is that the vivid recall of details. Tonic immobility is not unconsciousness. You're awake. Your brain is recording and encoding memories. And some of them are quite vivid. It just happens in a different way and about different things. So we're gonna segue into what the impact of that experience of trauma and the neurobiological changes that our bodies are undergoing on our memories, and maybe explain some of the things that we look at as indicators of a lack of credibility, like not remembering certain details and things of that nature. But to wrap this other part up and segue into the idea of memory is I called tonic immobility the last ditch survival mechanism. And probably when we think solely on the physical realm of acting or not acting, that's true. But the brain will do something else in this. And that is that the brain will go into a state of dissociation or depersonalization. I don't like to use psychiatric jargon, but there's no other way to explain it. Dissociation and depersonalization, that the experience of trauma is so overwhelming. The sensory experience is so incredible in speed and we just cannot take it in. And the experience kind of becomes fragmented from us. We pull ourselves back so that we may survive, right? It starts to put the essence of our personalities and our humanity at risk if we don't dissociate and depersonalize. Again, talking with survivors, we hear things like, I felt almost like an out-of-body experience, like it was happening to someone else, or I felt nothing. I just took my personality out of it and let the body experience it because I couldn't stop it. And the way of survival is to make oneself disappear in that. Oneself in the sense of that essence that makes one human. So the best discussion of this phenomena I've read is from a book by a guy named Bessel van der Kolk, and it's cited there. It's called The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. It's directed at or written for those who are in the healing mental health professions and dealing with the long-lasting effects of trauma. But it's really helpful for anyone who touches in any way or has been touched by this kind of any kind of traumatic experience. So I would recommend that book. I do not know if it's been translated, but it is a phenomenally good book to explain what's going on, both in terms of the biological stuff and in terms of what we see as a manifestation of that biological stuff. One of the interesting things that I just thought about as I was watching this is that in early research on trauma and fear and things of that nature, people looked at dogs and how dogs responded by, baring their teeth when they're threatened and things like that, changing their facial expression. And then you go back and look at the stupid snowman video, you'll see people kind of mimicking those facial expressions. We share it with the dogs, which I'm fine with, without a doubt. So that taking oneself away, maybe we've all experienced it in terms of the, kind of blanking out or removing ourselves from the experience of a boring drive. I used to have an hour and a half drive to and from work, and I would literally park in my parking spot in the morning and go, I don't remember a thing about getting here. My mind was elsewhere. Depersonalization, dissociated from that event, just because it was boring, right? That's sort of what we're talking about here. Again, Evelyn Yang, I fixed my eye on a spot on the wall and I just tried to avoid seeing his face, just waiting for it to be over. This idea of dissociation and depersonalization came home to me talking with victims of human trafficking who were trafficked for commercial sex purposes, and some of them quite young, 13, 14 years old. Seeing them act like little girls, but knowing that they had been forced to do sex acts 30 times a night sometimes. And how do they survive that? How do they survive that? And still, the little girl personality is depersonalized and dissociated from the experience, the overwhelming experience. It's just the way we survive. It's how we all do it. So that segues us into, especially this part about looking at a spot on the wall, into what happens when we experience a traumatic event and our brain dumps all these, and our other parts of our body are putting, all these chemicals into our body. What happens to our memories? Do we remember things in the same way? I bet if I could ask you how you ended up in front of the computer where you are listening to me, you could probably tell me you got up at a certain time, you drove to work, or you went to took your computer to your laptop to a house, set up and all that. You could probably tell me beginning when you got up and ending when you kind of got here. You would remember maybe that I cut out at some point, and because you were kind of paying attention maybe to what I was saying. That's memory at its finest. That's memory when there's no trauma involved at all. It's also very different from the way we remember things and what we remember when we're talking about memory in relation to a traumatic event. Back to school. This unusually large brain here has a part called the prefrontal cortex. That's the executive secretary function of the brain. That's the thinking part of the brain. And it covers it controls logical thought, okay? That is that if this happens, I'm gonna do the other thing, right? this, then that, takes in sensory details. The amygdala says no danger. Then the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus process that, and the prefrontal cortex can make logical decisions from that. Also covers impulse control. Some of the data that we rely on in talking about this comes from two different interesting sources. We're kind of out of the realm of like combat trauma and into the realm of attention deficit disorder and dementia and Alzheimer's, and how our brains control impulses, ADD, how they direct attention, control logical thought. Basically all that executive functioning stuff of the brain. Unlike the amygdala, if you remember, we talked about the amygdala being being a kind of old part of the brain, develops very soon, shared by a lot of animals. You know, a large prefrontal cortex develops very slowly, right? And there's actually a sex gender difference in the development of the brains. This will come as absolutely no surprise to the women in the audience, but the male prefrontal cortex, remember, logical thought and impulse control, develops more slowly than the female. The male does not reach the level of development, the apex, top of the development in the prefrontal cortex until around age 26. You know, the impulse control and things of that nature. Anyone who has raised children knows about this. Anyone who has raised teenagers knows about this. How many of you told teenagers not to do something and then they went ahead and did it anyway? And you got mad and you said, why did you do this? I'm going to go back. The prefrontal cortex. I was talking about with those of you who have raised teenagers. We'll come back to that why question and what the right answer is. But the prefrontal cortex, along with the hippocampus, which is another part of the brain, which is sort of down in the brainstem a bit, they worked in times when we're not stressed or experiencing trauma to bring in sensory input, what you see, what you hear, what you taste, and store it in memory in such a way that it can go from short-term memory to long-term memory. I'm simplifying this a lot. And then, you know, then we can, in reasonable circumstances, retrieve those memories and put them in a chronological, contextual narrative. I did this today. That's the best of times, right? One of the issues is, and if you will, one of the problems is that that part of the brain is extraordinarily, exquisitely sensitive to the chemicals that the amygdala dumps in the body at the time of stress. So those chemicals change the biology of our brain such that the workings of the prefrontal cortex are tamped down. And that means, as a practical matter, that during a traumatic event, surviving a traumatic event occurs without our thought often, and because the prefrontal cortex is suppressed and that data-driven processing, right? If this, then that we use as humans doesn't work. The rational part of the brain is impaired. And looking at it from, again, the cold, hard reality and we're using our 20/20 hindsight, not experiencing the trauma that the victim is, we can look at something that they did or did not do and say, that doesn't make any sense. And there's a whole host of things I think you could probably draw from your experience that illustrate that. A common one, we all have now cell phones. Why didn't you call for help? When he threatened you, why didn't you call for help? That requires if this, then that data-driven processing. That rational thought is impaired by the stress chemicals, by the response of the body. Again, survival, we don't want to be thinking too much about this. we don't need to reason out that we got to run away from the lion. We got to run. So data-driven processing, basically that whole pathway to rational thought, it's still open, maybe a bit, but it's flooded. It is flooded with these hormones, and you can't go that way. So when we ask questions like, you could have done this, and you reason from the data that you know. There was a phone there, you could have called. Why didn't you call? The answer is not that they are telling a lie or that it really wasn't a crime. The answer probably is that that pathway, that road to logical, rational thinking is flooded, and they can't do it. They are physically unable to do that. So working from there, because that has an impact on memory as well, let's talk about memory, how memory works. Okay, this is your brain just on fun stuff, listening to me. So we pay attention. You choose what to pay attention to, right? And the more you pay attention to something, the more likely it is that we're going to remember it. So our prefrontal cortex, in times when we're not stressed, not under trauma, is going to decide what is going to be paid attention. And then working with the hippocampus, it captures those details, categorizes them, starts that process of memory formation from short-term memory to long-term memory. Okay, that's how our brains work. That's how we pay attention. I don't think any of us can really argue with the concept that if we pay attention to something, we're more likely to remember it. Those of you who are teachers, professors, you can look out on your class and you can see who's paying attention and who's going to remember this for the test and who's not. And you might guess wrong, but most of the time we're pretty good at it. So what the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are doing is they're choosing what to pay attention to, what will capture our attention, and what we will remember. And it's deciding that certain things are central core details of the experience and others are peripheral details. The core details we're going to pay greater attention to. It's more likely that we will strongly encode those and be able to retrieve them accurately over time. Peripheral details say you'll remember this, but you won't remember how many times the background was blurry or something like that. That's a peripheral detail. It's not a core part of the experience. While you might have attuned to it at some point and on some level saw it, certainly, it's less likely to be encoded and strongly encoded at that. So it's less likely to be moved along that process of short-term memory to long-term memory. That's just how memory works, right? We can't remember every detail. I would think about that. If we remembered every detail, it would drive us absolutely bonkers. So there's a low road to memory as well. And it starts, I'll go back to this. There's a low road to memory. We talked, just before I got cut off, we were talking about the high road, what we pay attention to, prefrontal cortex decides that. The low road. So back to the amygdala, right? It's dumping those chemicals in and it's reading and driving the body to do things or not do things that, I'm sorry for this, but we'll go forward. So here's the kind of the takeaway message of this. Once the amygdala takes over and suppresses the action of the prefrontal cortex, now we're talking about a different memory storage issue. The way memories are stored in that situation when we're experiencing trauma is that the amygdala and other parts of the brain will store memories, emotional memories, what one feels, or sensory details, what one sees or hears, or even smells, and it will store those The ability to do that, to remember context and sequence is eliminated, if you will. We can't do it anymore. So whereas in a non-traumatic memory, reading what happened next, what happened first, and even this cause and effect kind of stuff is fairly easy for us to do. It's not possible in most instances when we're talking about those who have experienced a traumatic event. So context and sequence are not stored or encoded as strongly as emotional memories and as sensory memories. So one is more likely to remember what one smelled rather than how long it took to get someplace, or as an example. So while the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex no longer is rationally choosing what's a core detail. A core detail is really something that the amygdala will cause us in the moment to focus in on. And peripheral details are lost. Because we've experienced those peripheral details, because that was part of the sensory input, memories might be there, but they are not easily retrieved as the core details. And the core details might be something like what was out the window, or what one smelled, or what one heard. A core detail is like the officer hearing and remembering the brass from the fired shells hitting the pavement. Not what we might think is a core detail, and that is how many times he shot. So a core detail, and this is from Dr. Ford's testimony that we referenced way back, is the details that bring me here today are the ones I will never forget. And that's an important phrase. The core details are not easily forgotten. So what we teach law enforcement officers when we're teaching them about this is to ask the survivor at some point during the interview, what is it about that experience that you will never forget? Often it's a sensory memory, and asking about that sensory memory will open up pathways towards other memories, towards those peripheral details. What the upshot of this is that we need to remember, as we interview survivors, as we call upon them to relate to us or to other strangers what happened to them, that we understand that the memory is fragmented. It's not organized in that contextual chronological narrative. It may be, in our minds, incomplete, because what was judged a peripheral detail might very well be something that we need, that we think we need. That's one of the big things that when we talk about law enforcement doing interviews like this, we talk about how to really look at this as whether you really need that peripheral detail. One of the big ones is how long an event lasted, or whether you can use sensory details to get to that if you really do need it. And sometimes you do. But treating survivors of trauma who tell us what the core details are as being less credible because they don't remember things we think should be remembered is a recipe for disaster. We are driving against the biology, the neurobiology, and the reality that the people we serve are living when we do that. And we tend to do that all the time, me included. This is not a blame game. I am as good at it as everybody else in certain times. And we remember to, and remind people that disclosure is a process. Remember, we talked about way in the back, I said inconsistencies, that lawyers hate them, right? Inconsistency equals lies. Well, given the way we remember things and the impact of the neurobiology of trauma on memory, we have to understand now that disclosure is a process, and that inconsistencies in the sense of remembering something now that they didn't remember before is part of that process. It's not a convenient remembering because now all of a sudden it's important. Sure, it could be. There are liars, that people lie, but it's also, it's knowing this, it's more possible that that process of disclosure has led them to a memory of the event now that they didn't have perhaps on the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth retelling. So we shouldn't discount that. I'm gonna skip to this. So the neurobiology of trauma obviously drives how people behave to survive a traumatic event. It also changes the way we remember things, and it changes what we remember. Sensory details are usually encoded more strongly and remembered consistently over time, because sure, the act of retelling changes how we remember things. But sensory details are those that we tend to remember consistently over time. One of the other aspects of this is that our bodies learn how to survive. We as the human species learn how to survive traumatic events. And past victimizations will have a significant effect on how one survives a similar trauma. Think child sexual assault. When one survives, how one survives that at the outset will impact how the body reacts when similar things occur to it. So past victimization, we know it's a significant risk factor for future victimization. It's one of the most significant. If someone was sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetimes, they're more likely to be sexually assaulted again. And how that body survived that first part influences what the body does the next time to survive. It doesn't, what it does is it means usually that the survival mechanism or the survival behavior that was successful they'll jump right to. So people will skip, freeze, fight, flight, and jump right to just being immobile, as an example. And we run the risk of interpreting that as giving up or as consent, perhaps. But surrender is not consent. And we have to kind of keep that in mind. And it might be driven by past trauma interacting with the present response to the traumatic event. And as we know, hey, this doesn't stop. This doesn't stop with a traumatic event, that we will see consequences long after we could. So post-traumatic stress disorder, which I personally don't like that much because it's really just a picking from a certain list of behaviors that are, and if you get enough, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. It could be, you know, peri-traumatic stress disorder, which means what you feel right before the incident. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosis that I think doesn't help us much. But if we look at the behaviors that can come from the long-term consequences of trauma, things like an increase in depression, a withdrawal from family and friends and community, dissociation, emotional numbing, not going to class anymore if you're talking about a student, withdrawing from a faith community or something like that, and dissociating, pulling back from and removing yourself from the world, if you from your friends, from your neighbors. Anger, aggression, self-harm, other kinds of things that are sequelae or consequences of stress, of trauma. And these can be present in greater or lesser numbers, depending upon how much of those stress chemicals are in the body at any given time. And this is where that idea of the rewiring of the brain and the changes in neurobiology occur. It's really many trauma survivors are in a position or in a place of reliving that trauma over and over and over and over again. Their bodies have not stopped dumping those chemicals in or has not been able to reach some kind of balance with those chemicals. And things like intrusive memories and nightmares, self-harming behaviors. In sexual violence cases, one can deal with survivors who were traumatized and then they become more sexually active and not less. They abuse substances or have some other behavioral addictions. That all comes from potentially the long-term consequence of the rewiring of our brains by trauma and by how our body has reacted. And it's as though if you think back to the officer and how he relived the event, it's as though a survivor is doing that reliving without being asked to account or tell again what happened to them. And again, Bessler in this book, he really captures it by talking about recalibration of the alarm system. Everything's danger. And when everything is relevant as dangerous, it causes increased trauma and the increased trauma reaction, and that all compromises the brain. And the parts of the brain, unfortunately, that really communicate what it is to be alive and in community as a human. We can make that better with how we respond, and we can make it worse. But I think that we take the tact that physicians do, and we try to limit, we do no harm where we can do no harm, if it's within our power to do that. So tamp down those stress hormones and help them, and we will get better results. We will learn the truth with much less problem and fewer consequences to the health of those around us if we can do it this way. So where do we go with this information? So we know now you have a little bit of grounding in that. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Again, I'm going to blame my kids. And where do we go from here? What does it mean to you in your work, in your profession? Well, one of the things to think about is, how do you think Evelyn Yang responds when she sees a doctor? She was traumatized by the doctor. Obviously, I don't know this, but it wasn't part of the gosh, my brain went down. Part of the interview, but I'll bet that her heart rate increases. I'll bet you she sweats more. I'll bet you her blood pressure goes up. I'll bet you her respiration rate increases. I'll bet you she starts to maybe feel cold and shake a little bit when she has to go to the doctor, because the body is responding to that stimulus. There's a doctor, in the way that it survived the prior traumatic event, the doctor who assaulted her. And how did the officer behave? He was experiencing those same physical reactions. So now what do we, with this knowledge, do? Well, I think we should think about how we can deal with seeing the very same reactions in the people that we work with, and modifying things so that we can mitigate the long-term consequences. I think courts and you as judges have extraordinary power to really make sure that the truth-finding function of a trial is preserved, and that the defendant's rights are protected at the same time. And is there a way to structure the courtroom physically that would limit that response? Is there a way to structure the questioning by both parties so that it can limit that, but still protect the defendant's rights, because that is extraordinarily important as a function and as one of the roles that courts have. I think how we ask questions in court is really big. So how do we do it? Certainly here in the United States, we have a huge preference for in-court testimony live and chronologically and with contextual detail. That is, I can't tell you how many lawyers, when they first come to me for training, will get up and ask a question like, what happened? And then what happened next? And then what happened next? Those questions are going to be less than optimal in dealing with someone who is trying to retrieve traumatic memory. So how questions are asked in court is very important. And how much you as judges can control that, again, to get the optimum, to get the most truth out while protecting the defendant's rights. That's, and I'm telling you, I'm sending you out to do that work, and I fully realize that it's not easy, but it is worthy. So what other thing can we think about is, it's what I call psychosocial evidence, and that is, how can we allow, within the context of how trials are presented in your jurisdiction, can we allow someone to come in and talk about the impact of trauma and explain what for many people is unexplainable? Why didn't you scream, for instance? Well, it could be that that's a trauma reaction. It could be that that's the brain-based body's reaction to trauma. And you can, that kind of evidence, it educates people about the potential. It's still, the prosecutor still has to prove the case. So in proving the lack of consent or establishing force or coercion, can we look at, are people using the brain-based behaviors that are driven by trauma as evidence of something else? For instance, if they don't move, is that evidence of lack of consent, or evidence of consent? Or is it something that, is that a brain-based reaction to trauma that is brought about by a level of force or coercion? That's the trick. And also, can we allow a discussion of the long-term consequences of trauma? Because the long-term consequences of trauma are seemingly inconsistent with consensual sex. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that if they testify to feeling certain things that we know are brain-based reactions to trauma, that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that it wasn't consensual sex. But it does explain many things that a victim will do that can lead to, or at least be a building block of evidence towards showing that it wasn't a consensual sexual encounter, or the consensual encounter at all. So that's what that's your role. That's what I see as your role as judges with all this information that I've given you, is to balance, to do what you do every day, to balance the truth, finding function of trials with the rights of the individual parties involved. And if they're in conflict, what gives? And can we use this knowledge to reach those lofty goals? I obviously think that we can. That judgment is hampered a little bit by the fact that I practice only in the United States, and so I don't have experience in everybody's courtroom. But this, I hope, has explained some of the things that you have seen in your lives and in your work, and started the conversation and the thinking around, can we do it differently? And how differently can we do it? And still protect everybody's rights.